Welcome to the first episode in this three-part series looking at problematic influences on Namibian cybersecurity and cybercrime lawmaking and regulation crafting. My name is Frederico Links, and I'm a research associate with the Institute for Public Policy Research, Namibia's foremost think tank on public policy-related matters. In this first episode, we look at problematic African state narratives around national security and how these narratives are used to undermine human rights. To unpack this issue, I interviewed Professor Jane Duncan. Jane Duncan is a professor of digital society at the University of Glasgow and a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg. In 2018, she was appointed by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa to a panel to investigate abuses in the South African State Security Agency. Jane Duncan comes from a civil society background, having worked for the Freedom of Expression Institute for 15 years and having served as its executive director for 8 of those years. The Freedom of Expression Institute dealt with some of the earliest post-apartheid cases of freedom of expression violations, including violations of the right to protest and state harassment of activists. Jane Duncan is the author of The Rise of the Securocrats in 2014, Protest Nation in 2016, Stopping the Spies in 2018, and National Security Surveillance in Southern Africa in 2022. And she is a regular contributor to a range of journalistic publications. I hope you find this interview informative and useful. I certainly did. Before we start, let me just apologize for any sound quality issues. The interview was conducted via Zoom, and quality connectivity is always a bit of an issue. And now, I bring you Professor Jane Duncan. Hello, Jane, and thank you for making the time to talk to me. And the topic that I want us to discuss is the issues that you address, a national security narrative issue that you address in your book, National Security, Surveillance in Southern Africa, an anti-capitalist perspective. So to start us off, just to ground ourselves, what prompted you to write this book and have it published in 2022?
Thank you, Frederico, and thank you for the invitation. The reason why I was interested in writing this book is because I didn't see anything that was available at that stage that attempted to document the growth of surveillance capabilities and the rationale for this particular growth throughout Southern Africa. So I think I wanted to address that particular gap, to bring what is known together and to attempt to start to map some of the emerging trends in the region. But more broadly, I wanted to look at the reasons why this growth is taking place and what can be done about it. Because as surveillance capabilities have expanded, the definitions of national security that have driven the expansion in these capabilities have also expanded. And I wanted to ask the question, what do we do about those underlying rationales? And is there any basis for the rationales that are often given by government? And what I wanted to explore was some of the arguments that were being made at that time by the movement for the defunding of the police. So in other words, the abolitionist movement around abusive policing, particularly against Black working class people in the US, that spread as a movement around the world. And their focus was on looking at what one does about the system of policing as part of the broader system of oppression and exploitation, and what one could do in order to shrink those particular capabilities and to make sure that only the most essential policing functions are community-owned and controlled and serve the most pressing public safety purposes. So I was quite interested in applying abolitionist arguments to intelligence and to surveillance, which I don't really think has been done up to this point. And what this allows us to do is it prevents us from looping back into arguments for expanding the intelligence and surveillance capabilities of the state. Because what often happens when abuses take place, we make an argument that oversight, for instance, must be strengthened. We need to, for instance, establish an ombud to investigate abuses, which would inevitably be a state entity. And all too often, those state entities land up being captured by the very state that we want them to oversee. We may make an argument about the need to strengthen parliamentary oversight of these capabilities. Now, all of that is important, but often those kinds of arguments lead to a situation where you're strengthening the state, you're strengthening the very state that is often the source of the problem of ongoing oppression and exploitation in our countries. So I wanted to try and learn some of the lessons from the abolitionist movement and apply it to intelligence and surveillance to ask the question, what about these capabilities are basic societal functions? Would we miss anything in our lives, for instance, if we didn't have state intelligence agencies, if they were all shut down in the region? And they didn't have surveillance capabilities? What would that actually mean to public safety and security? So then I started looking at lessons learned from the liberation movements, for instance, and how intelligence and security and surveillance capabilities were established in the context of emancipatory movements, because there I think we could start learning lessons about what society really needs in order to protect its safety and security, as opposed to what governments or states or ruling elites think they need in order to protect themselves, because the two are often conflated. And then I wanted to work out from there and identify what the most fundamental intelligence and surveillance capabilities society needs in order to protect itself, and then start to develop something along the lines of a program or manifesto for fundamental change to these capabilities in a way that didn't land up inadvertently strengthening the very state that we're often complaining about.
Thanks, Jane, for that overview. I just want to take you back to the rationales, the definitions, the sort of narratives of national security that you say have been changed, have been expanded to enable some of the practices that you unpack in the book. Can you speak to some of the specific problematic national security narratives or definitions that underpin and enable the state surveillance practices across Southern Africa that you flag in the book?
Well, since the collapse of the Cold War, we've seen an international trend where intelligence agencies have really struggled to justify their existence. And as a result of that, we've seen them expanding into areas and redefining major social problems as national security problems in ways that has been quite unprecedented. So we've seen food security, for instance, issues relating to access to food being defined as a national security problem. Health, borders have also been absorbed into national security mandates. So increasingly, we're seeing a broad range of social issues that are really driven by the continuing legacy of colonialism and extractivism on the continent, including in the Southern African region, that have then been built on and intensified by local political elites who continue to benefit from these exploited social relations. And they've had a vested interest in expanding the mandates of intelligence agencies in order to stabilize increasingly fractious social relations that we've seen across the region. And in the wake of the 2008 global recession, we also saw not just an Arab Spring, but a Southern African Spring, where many, particularly younger people, unemployed people, were getting onto the streets and protesting a lack of jobs and, a variety of issues impacting on their quality of life. And it's this protest wave that governments seem to be particularly interested in monitoring, and as a result of that, we saw the purchasing of more and more sophisticated spy tech, particularly from the global north and the global east. And what they've done in order to justify this kind of expansive use of intelligence and surveillance is they have increased the range of issues that intelligence agencies focus on, so that they are no longer simply focusing on national security threats, but they're also focusing on national interests as well, and how to pursue national interests as part of a national security mandate. And we've actually recently had this debate in the context of legislative reform in South Africa, where there's been an attempt, partially successful, to expand the definition of national security away from focusing on immediate and imminent threats, which, are fairly quantifiable, they're fairly measurable, to focusing on how to use intelligence and inevitably the surveillance capabilities to expand the country's national interests abroad. And this is something that intelligence agencies in the wake of the Cold War have been doing around the world, where they have been setting up economic intelligence units that focus on how to manipulate trade relations, for instance, and use espionage for those purposes in order to gain competitive economic advantages internationally. And I think nowhere has this been more apparent than in what we refer to as the Five Eyes countries. So in other words, the intelligence alliance that was set up by the UK and the USA in the wake of the Second World War, that then subsequently incorporated Australia and New Zealand and Canada, and that is the largest known signals intelligence surveillance capability in the world today. And from what we've seen from documents that have been leaked by former National Security Agency whistleblower Edward Snowden, the capabilities of the Five Eyes surveillance network is massive indeed. And what do they do with these capabilities? Well, they move far beyond using them to protect national security in a traditional kind of way. So, for instance, anticipating and protecting countries against terrorism threats. But they use them in the context of the African continent, for instance, to spy on politicians, to spy on social movements that threaten their economic interests on the continent, to spy on companies. So, for instance, in the case of South Africa, they spied on negotiators for MTN, who were attempting to negotiate interconnection agreements with other countries. They spied on the former presidency of Jose Eduardo dos Santos in Mozambique, in order to attempt to map what the Mozambican government oil interests. So, and they've also spied on African politicians to try and identify what their negotiating positions are going to be at the World Trade Organization. So this is why it is so dangerous to accept this massive expansion of national security mandates that we've seen happening internationally, that I think increasingly Southern African governments, including most recently in South Africa, are building on in order to use surveillance for a range of issues and social problems that they were never designed to address.
I just want to correct you there. You said Jose Eduardo dos Santos. of Mozambique is actually Angola, the former Angolan president. But were you referring to Mozambique or were you referring to Angola?
I was referring to Angola.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the chapters that stands out to me, given the issue is one I'm very interested in, is chapter 4, Mass Surveillance and National Security Imperialism. What do you say about the mass surveillance practices of Southern African states?
Well, for one thing, Southern African countries use mass surveillance capabilities that are not traditionally recognized as being about mass surveillance. For instance, when we talk about mass surveillance, particularly in the context of the international debate, we are often focusing on signals intelligence surveillance, so the kind of surveillance that is undertaken by the Five Eyes countries. Which uses dragnet surveillance, and then it uses artificial intelligence in order to process huge quantities of data that have been scooped up in a dragnet. So that is really the kind of IP surveillance that we've come to associate with mass surveillance debates internationally. But I think that kind of mass surveillance is extremely expensive and technologically sophisticated, and requires a huge amount of upkeep. And as a result of that, Southern African countries that often can't afford these highly sophisticated forms of mass surveillance have sought to conduct mass surveillance by other means. And one of the ways in which they've done that is SIM card registration, because SIM card registration allows governments to develop a database of individuals that can then be tracked using the data that is collected about them. And SIM card registration can also enable other forms of mass surveillance. So, for instance, governments have been acquiring, and I know that there is some evidence of South African governments doing this. They can acquire what are known as IMSI catchers, or what are known in South Africa as grabbers, which are devices that mimic base stations of cell phones, and cell phones attach or they connect to those IMSI catchers rather than to the cell phone network base stations. And the data and even the content of the communications can also be collected as well by those IMSI catchers. Now, if governments have the IMSI catchers and they also have SIM card registration, then they can use the IMSI catchers and compare the cell phone numbers that have been collected by the IMSI catcher against the SIM card registration database, and establish the names and addresses of everybody who has participated in a protest, for instance, and carried a cell phone with them. So these are the forms of bulk surveillance or mass surveillance, I think, that are being used increasingly by Southern African countries. We know that South Africa, for instance, has IP-based mass surveillance in the Civilian Intelligence Agency, the State Security Agency. We know that Mozambique, through its military, has also obtained IP-based surveillance from China. But we know very little else about whether other Southern African countries have been able to obtain IP-based surveillance. There is some indication of Zimbabwe having done that, also through the military as well. But what we learn from studying mass surveillance in Southern Africa is the sheer diversity of practices that Southern African countries have, or governments have resorted to, that have allowed them to practice mass surveillance by other means.
Yeah, one of the laments against what these trends that you have sketched is that privacy is dying, or privacy is already dead across much of the world, of course, but in our context, in Southern Africa and across the continent, that even before we've really started having serious privacy discussions. And of course, the rights that are implicated when privacy is undermined. So we are only now starting to have this discussion. What is your take on the privacy is dead lament that is starting, I think, to become something that we're hearing across the continent and across the region?
I don't think that's the case at all. I think when people argue that privacy is dead, I think they're just giving up one of their fundamental rights rather than fighting for it. And I think, as we've seen across the region and in fact across the world, there are major struggles going on in order to protect people's right to private space, their right to think and deliberate and to organize, their right to participate politically, for instance, free from interference by the state and the private sector as well. And we've actually seen that these kinds of struggles can be far more successful in holding governments to account in terms of how they use and abuse these surveillance capabilities than the official oversight structures that are established. And it's in these moments when there are surveillance scandals or when there is a public focus on the misuse of these capabilities that often pressures for reform grow, because then journalists become involved in writing about these issues. There's broader public pressure. I know certainly in the context of the most recent reform in South Africa, what would have been a fairly arcane General Intelligence Laws Amendment Bill that was amending, all of the major intelligence laws in South Africa would have received very little attention. But because of public mobilization around concerns that civil society was going to be vetted increasingly by the State Security Agency, and also because of concerns about the definitions in the very mandates that we're speaking about, there were thousands of people who became involved. In fact, Parliament was overwhelmed by thousands and thousands of submissions of people protesting. People set up signature campaigns, and this had a massive impact. And it led to a situation where many of the most abusive aspects of the bill were walked back. And I think that these kinds of successes have been replicated in other parts of the region, where we've seen, if there is a major public pushback and if people say, no, we're not going to accept this, we don't think that privacy is dead, it's very much alive, and we're going to act in the defense of our privacy and basic democratic space, that those kinds of pushbacks can actually have a real and meaningful impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, there are certainly lessons to be learned from what happened in South Africa recently, as you sketched it. But I mean, South Africa aside, we in the Namibian context, what we come up against is a sort of surveillance realism, where you have people within civil society, people within the media, and ordinary Namibians. When you raise the issues of the overreach of the national security mandates of, say, the intelligence agency, and you trying to address some of these issues of mass surveillance and unlawful or surveillance abuse, then the narratives that the state are pushing are sort of the ones that even some of our associates in civil society, in the media, in the public, then use to counter our arguments. So the sense of surveillance realism being that this is inevitable, that we should resign to it, is a very real issue that we deal with. And I find it in some of the other countries in the region where I've spoken to people as well. So how would you advise, given what sort of what you know about responses, what is there that civil society and academia and the media can do to counter, these sorts of democracy and human rights undermining narratives around why, national security related surveillance, mass surveillance is necessary. What would you advise?
Well, I think start at the macro level and look at the mandate and look at what aspects of the mandate are absolutely necessary and argue for those only. And then argue in the same way that the abolitionist movement has done in relation to policing, argue for the rest of the mandate and for the capabilities that are being used in the name of the mandate to be significantly pared down or even removed entirely. So, for instance, I don't think that an intelligence agency should be using its surveillance capabilities in order to further the economic interests of a particular country. I think that should be left to the relevant Department of Trade and Industry. Because bear in mind that when a national security agency gets involved, it's using the most secretive and shadowy capabilities that the state has at its disposal. And as a result, the potential for abuse is tremendous. So if, for instance, the intelligence agency, the NCIS in Namibia has an economic intelligence unit, if it's using its capabilities in order to further its economic interests, there I think an argument should be made for those that aspect of its mandate to be stripped out and for those capabilities to no longer be used. I don't think that there's any argument for an intelligence agency to be using mass or bulk surveillance where there isn't a reasonable suspicion of criminality. And I think there is an international movement that one can tap into that has been pushing, and to an extent in some places winning that particular argument. So this is what I mean when I talk about shrinking or drastically reducing the rationales for the use of these expanding surveillance capabilities. And then I think more narrowly, there's a lot of basic ordinary work that can take place around documenting suspected abuses and trying to turn it into evidence so that complaints can be laid. If, for instance, there is a complaints receiving body, an ombud or a public protector, there can be a body of evidence that is being built up. And one of the difficulties that one has in this area is how do you prove that surveillance has taken place if, in fact, there's no user notification? So, in other words, in some countries, people need to be informed that their communications have been intercepted once investigations have reached a non-sensitive stage. And this increasingly is becoming part of international law. And it's certainly something that one needs to push for. So when one has user notification, then you start to build up a body of knowledge about who is in fact being surveilled and whether that surveillance is genuinely in the interests of public safety or not. But in the absence of user notification, then a slow, steady process of documenting suspected abuses and turning that documentation or making sure that documentation is rigorous enough in order for it to qualify as evidence, and then laying that at the door of the public protector or whoever in the country is responsible for investigating alleged intelligence abuses, and then continuing to knock on the door of that individual, I think is extremely important but slow burning work. And what it does is it creates a paper trail that can then be referred to later on. There are also going to be investigative journalists who'll be working on these issues as well. And often investigative journalists are the people who have access to sources inside intelligence agencies and are most likely to be tipped off about the existence of surveillance. So this is why we often see investigative journalists being the first to know about whether surveillance capabilities are being abused. But if there has been a body of evidence that's been built up and a paper trail of complaints, once the time comes where irrefutable evidence comes out through a court case, for instance, or through an investigative journalism story, then you have built up a momentum and hopefully a level of public consciousness that can be escalated into a demand for a complete legislative change.
Yeah, I think that is something that certainly we are trying to do here in Namibia. Given everything that you've said and what you've written and so forth, what would you like anybody who listens to this take away from this discussion?
I think that national security is one of the most secretive areas of the state, but it's also one of the areas of the state in which governments and ruling parties, and often factions of ruling parties, exercise the most power. It gives them a huge amount of securocratic power, which they can exercise under the cloak of secrecy. So they are incredibly dangerous for any country that is seeking to better itself, and for any social and political movements that are struggling for fundamental social and political change. So transforming these agencies, I think, should be central to what these social and political movements should do. It's not enough to simply focus on struggles for bread and butter issues. It's also important to fight for the democratic space that's necessary in order to win those bread and butter issues. So I think undertaking public awareness raising about the dangers of these capabilities, how common the abuse of these capabilities are, and what people can do in order to push back against their abuse. And also, it's important to publicize success stories as well, because they build confidence in people's abilities to strike back against what is often this very frightening and shadowy area of state power. I think once we start to do that, then we start assisting people to understand the fact that they, in fact, are not to do anything about these problems. They, in fact, are very powerful. And that kind of collective social power has been exercised very successfully in many parts of the world.
Jane Duncan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For more on this topic, please read our complimentary primer on the impact of problematic African state narratives on Namibian cybersecurity and cybercrime lawmaking. You can find the primer on the IPPR website at ippr.org.na. And please be on the lookout for the other 2 episodes of the Problematic Influences series. This work was carried out in the context of the Africa Digital Rights Fund, with support from the Collaboration on International ICT Policy for East and Southern Africa, CIPESA. Thank you and goodbye.